It's wonderful to be here. My name is Leor Zmigrod, and for the past 10 years, I've conducted experiments with thousands of people around the world, where I've compared people who are very ideological, who see the world in black and white terms, and who will not shift their morality or their ideology. And I've compared their brains to people who are a lot more open to nuance and evidence and different perspectives. And today, I have a question for you. This might be an unexpected question, but what I'd like to ask you is to take a moment to think about your own personality, your own mind, your own thinking style, and to tell me whether you think that you tend to be closed to evidence. Do you think you are rigid in your thinking? Do you think, in other words, that you might have an ideological brain? Now, most of us would say, of course not. I am the most rational, balanced, and open thinker. I would never be seduced by narrow ideologies or extreme ways of thinking. But many of us would actually be wrong. Because although we tend to think that extremism is other people's problem, and we are safe and immune, many of us are actually a lot more susceptible than we realize. And today, I want to talk with you about some of the hidden characteristics in your personality and your brain that might put you or your friends or your family at risk for being drawn into a closed, intolerant ideology. And we'll also talk about some of the ways in which we can make our minds more resilient, how we can build a kind of strength against extreme populistic ideologies, so that when a new one comes along, as one surely will sometime soon, we will be stronger and more resilient against it. And so one of the key things that we have to dispel, a myth that we have to get rid of, is the idea that there's a small group of people who is susceptible to extreme ideologies, and that is very different to everyone else, who is very resilient, who would never join a kind of extreme ideology. But actually, in my studies, I found that rather than two different binary groups, we actually all exist on a continuous spectrum, where some people are more susceptible, some are a lot more resistant, and most of us lie somewhere in between. So that some people, whenever a new extremism or totalitarian ideology comes along, they will run towards it. They will embrace all its rigid rules and rituals and identities. Whereas other people, no matter how much you push them, they will never surrender to that kind of totalitarian thinking. And the question that I've been thinking about for the last 10 years is what affects where we are on the spectrum? What are the factors that affect whether you are more susceptible or more resilient? And thinking about that spectrum can give us huge insights into what it is that we bring to our ideologies, but also how our ideologies might actually affect our emotion, our logic, our reasoning in everyday life, not just in political settings. And so to get into this, what I've been thinking about is really how does the brain process ideologies? What kinds of brains amongst us today are most likely to be extreme? And today we'll be talking about what are some of those characteristics. Why is it that some brains are more easily attracted to extreme ideologies than others? But also, what's the solution? How can we build societies, minds, that can be even more anti-ideological, that reject the kind of closed ways of thinking that many ideologies encourage in us? And so, to get us started, I'll tell you a little bit about the kinds of experiments that I've run. Because what I've been doing is uniting two different disciplines. One is politics, and the other is neuroscience, to help create this field called political neuroscience, where we use methods from neuroscience, neuroimaging, psychology, experimental cognition, to really understand the brains of people who believe in ideologies to extreme degrees. And I'll give you a little hint about some of the key things that I've discovered. The first is that actually there are psychological, even biological factors that can affect why some of us tend to go towards ideological thinking, but that at the same time, our ideologies can have an impact on us. And if we participate and immerse ourselves in rigid ideologies, that can have an impact on our bodies and our brains in physical ways that we can see with the power of neuroimaging and psychology. And so, before we head into all this exciting science, or at least I think it's exciting, it's important to take a moment to think about what is ideology. Right? It's a word that's used a lot and historically has been used to mean all kinds of things, from very bad things to very good things, right? Amongst us, some people will think that if you have an ideology, that makes you a very moral person, that makes you a good person, that in order to be good and moral in the world, you need rigid beliefs and convictions that are unshakable. But other people look at ideology as something very oppressive, something that's imposed on us from outside and distorts how we experience reality. Now, rather than thinking about ideologies as these big isms, as communism and fascism and these big historical movements, I'm interested in thinking about it psychologically. What does it mean for a mind psychologically to think in an ideological way? And the reason I'm interested in the psychology of it is because that allows us to understand many, many different ideologies. Because there are some that sound like they oppose each other, right? There's very left-wing extremism, right-wing extremism, nationalistic, religious. Now, in the last decade, they are coming online, and the kinds of radicalization forces are unprecedented, happening on social media, in a moment, happening also through AI chatbots. And so we need to understand what is the psychological structure of thinking ideologically that many of these movements, that many of these also online agents use to radicalize people, to brainwash people. And so for me, when I think about what does it mean to think ideologically, I am not interested in what you believe. I'm actually interested a lot more in how you believe, because that gives us a much better sense of what it means to think extremely, dogmatically, stubbornly, passionately, but without actually thinking only about whether it's left-wing or right-wing, environmentalist or nationalist, and that gives us a much stronger ground to assess ideologies and understand where they come from and how they affect us. And so, the thing is that if I asked you, like I did at the beginning, do you think you have an ideological mind? People will say, absolutely not. And that's partly because people like to think of themselves as very rational beings, but also because we actually have very little self-knowledge. We're actually not very good at knowing ourselves. So when I wanted to find out who is most ideological, who is most rigid, or who is not, instead of asking people to tell me what they think, I've used unconscious cognitive and neural methods to study this instead. And so I'll show you now what I've used to study people's levels of rigidity and flexibility. Now, a person who is cognitively rigid, they tend to see the world in black and white terms. They see everything as a binary, black or white, good or evil, right or wrong. There's no nuance in between. And a person who is cognitively rigid will really struggle to adapt to change. They will struggle to switch their mind. They'll struggle to take on evidence or to adapt to new changes in their environments. Now, in order to test people's cognitive rigidity, I've invited them to play games, and I can show you some of these games today. So one kind of game is a card game. And in this game, you have a card at the top of the screen, and you need to match it to one of three at the bottom of the screen. Now, initially, as a player, you don't know what the rule is, but quickly you learn that when you match a blue card with a blue card, you'll be rewarded with points. So you apply that on the next round, and then you'll do a red card with a red card, and you'll get points again. And so you'll apply that color code again and again, green on green, red on red, blue on blue. And so people will start playing the game, they'll get into the rhythm of it, into this habit and ritual, and they'll feel like they've mastered the game. But then, after a while of playing, suddenly the rule changes. And I'm interested in that moment of change. Because some people, the cognitively flexible people, will notice, okay, the old rule doesn't work anymore. Let me change and try something new instead. And quickly they'll realize that now they can match circles with circles and triangles with triangles, and they'll adapt and move on. They'll listen to the evidence and change their behavior. But other people, the most cognitively rigid thinkers, when they encounter that change, they hate it. Instead of adapting their behavior, they resist it, and they apply the old rule again and again, even though it doesn't work anymore. They're now losing points instead of gaining points. And instead of adapting, they stick to the old rule. And what that allows us to do is to measure whether a person tends to be flexible, adaptable to new evidence and change, or whether they hate it, they resist it, and want to stick to old patterns instead. So that's one kind of way of measuring how adaptably you think or not. There's one more game that we can play together. Don't worry, I won't test you. You can play it in your mind. And this is a very different game. This is not a game about kind of visual cards. This is a game about imagination. And what I ask people is to take a moment, and I give them an everyday object. Today, I'll give you a cup. And I say, okay, take a few minutes and think about all the things you can do with a cup. Everything you can imagine. And when I do this experiment with people, I invite them to write down all their ideas, to spend 2 minutes, tell me everything they can imagine. It can be boring, can be normal, it can be avant-garde or exciting. I don't care. Just give me all of your ideas. And so you think about this for a moment. Can you still hear me okay? Yeah? Some less so. We're adapting to change. And some people will tell me, kind of a rigid thinker will tell me, you can drink coffee from a cup, you can drink tea, you can drink hot chocolate, maybe you can even drink whiskey secretly from a cup. They'll give me 20 ideas for all the drinks you can drink from a cup. So they'll be very intelligent, they'll have many, many ideas, but they'll all be standard. They'll all kind of have the same function. But someone else, a more flexible thinker, will say, sure, you can drink coffee or tea or hot chocolate from a cup, but you can also use it as a toothbrush holder. You can use it in many different ways. You can use it to put your iPhone against as a smartphone holder. Or you can use it to plant a flower inside the cup. Or you can use it to play golf. And as you can see, this person can tell me the exact same number of ideas. They can also give me 20 ideas, but their mind is going in many directions. Their imagination is very fluid, very fluent, right? They're thinking not just about what you can drink, but they're flipping the object on its head. They're thinking about it in that creative, diverse, flexible way. And what I've found when I've given people these kinds of games to play is that their flexibility or rigidity on these kinds of tasks hugely predicts their ideologies. That actually, when we map on people's rigidity and flexibility, the people who are most rigid are the ones who are going to support violence the most. They're going to support their ideological group regardless of any costs. They're even willing to sacrifice their life for it. And they're not going to be open to evidence or change. They're going to stick to what they know, and regardless of any counter-evidence or counter-challenges, they are going to stick to what they know, what they believe. And when we look at the political spectrum, we actually see a very interesting way in which this cognitive rigidity is linked to ideological rigidity. We find that people both on the extreme left and on the extreme right tend to be the most psychologically rigid, whereas those who are more independent, more moderate, maybe more suspicious of those pre-established political identities, they tend to be the most flexible thinkers in all these kinds of games, the imagination games and the adaptability games. And what that tells us is that we can start to map people's cognition, their emotion, all the way in which they process information about the world to their ideologies. There are cognitive and even emotional characteristics that predict how extreme or dogmatic you're going to be about your chosen ideology. And it doesn't matter what ideology I studied, whether I looked at politics or nationalism or religion, I kept on seeing the same pattern. It wasn't what people believed, but it was how they believed. And importantly, what we learned from this is that these tasks, these games, right, they had nothing to do with politics. It was purely about how a person's mind processed information, responded to change, solved problems and puzzles. But that trickled down to everything, right? Our psychology bleeds into our politics and ideologies as well. And amazingly, in my studies and the studies of other political neuroscientists, what we're finding is that these patterns go all the way into our bodies, into our physical biology. In my own experiments, I've studied a neurochemical that I think you've all heard of called dopamine. And dopamine, as we know, governs our sense of excitement, right? Our experience of surprise and thrill. We all want the dopamine rush. But what dopamine also does is it affects how we learn. And so it affects how we respond to change. And I found that there are even genetic factors that affect how dopamine works in your own body, that affects whether you're going to be a more rigid thinker or a more flexible one. And we're even now seeing this go all the way into the neurobiology of our brains even further. There are studies showing that there are brain differences in the structure and function of different brain areas depending on your ideology. So for instance, one pattern that we keep on finding in the field is that there is a particular part of the brain called the amígdala. And it's a small part of our brain tucked in the very middle, and it's responsible for our processing of negative emotions, right? How we feel fear, threat, disgust. All those negative emotions, they are controlled by the amígdala. And what scientists are finding is that people who have a larger amígdala tend to have more right-wing beliefs, whereas people with more left-wing beliefs have a smaller amígdala. And this pattern has replicated in multiple countries, in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of participants. And it raises fascinating, disturbing questions. Why, right? Why would the size of your amígdala be related to your political ideology? And this leads to a kind of chicken and egg question of what comes first, right? Is it that someone might be inborn with an amígdala that's larger, and that makes them more attracted to ideologies that deal with negative emotions, like feelings of fear, threat, disgust of things that are foreign? Or is it that actually if you participate for a long time in an extreme and dogmatic way in an ideology that constantly elicits those emotions, that engages fear and threat and disgust, could that ideology actually change the structure and shape of your brain? So some people call this a chicken and egg question, right? Of which side does it go? I think my intuition is that it actually goes both ways. That on one hand, our brains affect which ideologies we choose, but also when we immerse ourselves, when we participate in ideology so strongly, that can have an impact on our brains. And so all these factors together, the psychological, the biological, the genetic, all affect, in the end, our position on that spectrum of susceptibility, whether we tend to be more susceptible to extreme ideologies or whether we tend to be more resilient. And all of this sounds fascinating, but it also can sound scary because it sounds like these things determine us. Our brains, our bodies affect our ideologies in ways that we never expected or could never have imagined. And so that raises another question of, can people change, right? If you are born with susceptibilities that make you at risk for being susceptible to thinking in closed, extreme ways, is that fixed or can it change? Can people unchain their minds from toxic dogmas, from ideologies that are narrow or extreme? And the answer is that they can, and that they do. And that actually someone who is very susceptible can shift their position to being more resilient, and it can also go the other way around. And that's where we can put all of this together to understand how different social, economic, war kinds of catastrophes can really mobilize people towards extreme, sometimes populist, sometimes dogmatic ideologies that have a true effect on their bodies and brains. But we can use the fact that we can change and understand it better in order to build societies that are stronger and more resilient, so that when an authoritarian leader comes along, we don't all just go with them. And in order to understand how all of this comes together, we have to think about the environment a person is in, the level of stress, the level of adversity that they're in. Because one of the findings that we see most clearly is that when you stress someone out, they immediately become more rigid. And that makes sense when we think about ourselves, right? When we become more stressed, we think in a more narrow way about the world. We're less likely to explore, to want change, to want uncertainty. In times of stress, we conserve our energies. We want to stick to what we know. And we see this really profoundly in the context of ideologies as well. When pandemics come along, when natural disasters come along, when wars or big conflicts enter our lives, people become more dogmatic about any ideology. Whatever their ideology is, they suddenly become more extreme. And so we can understand how we can spiral into extremism, how our environment can trigger our psychological vulnerabilities, so that if you have someone who is already very susceptible, very at risk for thinking in a closed way, and you have someone else who actually very resistant, very resilient in the face of those ideologies, when a big push comes along, when a trigger, when some kind of stress or catastrophe, whether it's personal or political, suddenly it becomes very easy for a person who is at risk to become radicalized. But someone who is more resilient will need a much bigger push. They'll need much more propaganda, more stress in order to get them to be radicalized. But someone who's already at risk from the beginning, because of their biology, because of their cognition, it'll be very easy to spiral them into extremism. And when we think about this, kind of all these factors coming together, and we think about the climate that we're in right now, it's actually a huge, huge reason for concern. Because the way in which people are now consuming information on social media, now from AI in the last 2 years, the way in which those algorithms are designed to give you information and entertainment, these are algorithms that try to give you the most binary information, right? The most emotionally threatening information, the information that is most radical and most binary. And so when you put people, and especially young people, adolescents and children now, on these platforms, you're putting them at huge risk, because you're taking potentially minds that are already vulnerable, right? The minds who tend to think in rigid ways, and you put them in an information ecosystem that gives them rigid information only. And that is a catastrophic way to build very, very dogmatic citizens in our societies. And so that leads to many questions of how do we go against these processes, right? Especially for young people who might not have experienced anything else, and for whom AI and social media are suddenly huge radicalizing forces. They might now no longer trust in governments and institutions, but they trust the influencers on their phones who tell them how to live, what it is to be a good person, what are the routines that they should have, the rituals, the ideologies that would make them a good person, that would bring them health and happiness and wealth and acceptability. And so that's why, in order to understand this chicken and egg problem, right, of how our brains affect our ideologies and how our ideologies affect us, we have to look at the environment, at the nest of this chicken and egg problem, in order to understand people's levels of risk and resilience. And so when we put all this together, we can see how actually these ideologies don't exist outside of us. They enter us. Right? Our bodies come to reflect the ideologies we believe in. So that if we have intolerant ideologies, extreme ideologies in our societies, that's not just a social problem. It's not just a political problem. It's actually a very personal problem for each of us. Because our ideologies can affect our own bodies, our brains, our physiology. We learn that if you become a very stubborn and passionate believer to any ideology, you are likely to become a human being who is less flexible, less sensitive, less empathic, and I think ultimately less free. And so, how do we get out of this cycle? I think the first is to remember that our brains are very plastic, and actually we have the capacity to change, and we have the freedom to choose elsewhere. We can actually choose what kind of brain we want to have or we want to be. Because although we might have a certain position on that spectrum of susceptibility, we can change our own position. Each of us has a range of possibilities, because our position is actually, it's not a determined fact, it's a potential. And if it's a potential, it means we can change. And that's why I think it's so important to think about how to cultivate our flexibility. What are actions we can individually take if we want to live in a more anti-ideological way? And by anti-ideological, I'm thinking about a way that is accepting of nuance, accepting of evidence, that wants to engage with different ideas, that you don't want to put yourself in a small binary category. You see yourself as a full human being, and you see others as full human beings, so that you don't need to judge a person solely based on their ideology or their identity. You can see each person in their richness. And so to cultivate that flexibility, there are several things that we can do as individuals, as teachers, as parents, as members of our societies, if that's what we value. Because it does depend on whether we value that flexibility, because I think we live now in a time that actually really champions rigidity, and that many people think that you need to be rigid in order to be moral. But I think that that rigidity can ultimately destroy a part of you. It can have really negative impact on your body, on your brain, on your mental freedom, your capacity to think that, you can plant a flower inside a cup. So how do we do that? How do we build that resilience against ideological thinking? There are three aspects that I often think about. The first involves the personal changes we can make if we want. Right? I'm not going to give you a recipe or a system of rules, because if I give you a system of rules for how to be an flexible thinker, that would become its own ideology. And so it's not about giving rules and routines and rituals for how to be flexible. It's about thinking about broad guidelines, broad themes that you can each question in your life, if you want, in order to be a more flexible, creative, and open thinker. And there are kind of two personal changes, or two personal reflections that I think are important. The first is to take all the routines of your day, all the habits, all the forms of repetition, all the things that you do in exactly the same way every day. Some of them are good, some of them are healthy, but some forms of repetition are actually ways for us to avoid change, because routines and habits really stop us from any kind of uncertainty, because we do the thing in exactly the same way, and we think in exactly the same way each time. So consider all the forms of repetition, of rituals, of routines, of habits, and question them. Are they potentially restricting you? Are they narrowing your sense of self? Or can you actually let some of those go? Can you live in a less repetitive way? And once you do that, you start to feel, well, I think the excitement of being human, which is about being a bit messy, having a lot of change, having a lot of exploration. But it's also about learning that repetition is not necessarily a good thing. And today, if we go to a bookstore, we'll be told about all the habits we should have, atomic habits, incredible habits that will make us stronger and more profitable. But I don't think they make us better or freer human beings. So if you want, question your habits, question those routines. And that links to the second aspect of the personal changes you can make, which are about infusing your life with that creativity, that flexibility of thought. That means that you can look at something in many different ways. And this is not just, I'm not telling everyone, go become painters and artists and actors. You can, but it's not about being creative only in the traditional sense. It's about taking whatever it is that you do, whether you're an accountant or engineer or entrepreneur, and doing it in a more flexible way. Rather than sticking to the same approach, the same formulas every time, trying to inject change and creativity into your life. And when you start to practice that creativity and flexibility in everything you do, that will help you become a more tolerant person, also in your politics and your ideologies. And if we all do that, we can all become a little more humane and a little less dogmatic and rigid in our beliefs. And that is part of what we should think about also as collectives. And I think about that now a lot in terms of education. Because I know a lot of teachers, a lot of parents are really concerned by their children who, as young as 11, can become really, really brainwashed by different kinds of ideologies. Some ideologies have a clear name, but now we're getting new types, ones that don't have a name, but which are very extreme, are very judgmental, are very harsh, and have that black and white morality that I think is very dangerous. And if we want, as educators or parents or teachers, to help our students learn to be more flexible, I think we need to have that kind of flexibility in our education system, to teach children not just to repeat after me, but to also rebel a little bit, to do something in a different way. And again, it doesn't have to be in art class. It can be in math. It can be in design. It can be in anything you do in life. Teaching children how to be flexible, how to bring out their most creative, original side is so important, because that's the only way in which we can combat authoritarianisms that try to make citizens more narrow and obedient. So, of course, you want to have children that listen, that care about others, but that doesn't always have to come with very strict rules. It can come from values of care, of humanity. It doesn't have to come from ideologies. And I think this links to the final point I want to make, which is that I think we really need institutional change. But that, when I say institutions, I don't mean, okay, we can give up and it's just about people who are in institutions and all of us can, just do the first two. Because institutional change is about which leaders we choose to support. And right now, I'm afraid that we're in a time that really celebrates the leaders who are most rigid, who are most dogmatic, who will not listen to evidence, who will not change their minds. We think that those are strong leaders, right? The ones who have convictions that will never move. But actually, I'm not sure that that's what strong leadership does look like, or what we should want that kind of leadership to look like. Because if we actually opt for and celebrate leadership that does think about incorporating evidence, that when the evidence and opinion suggest that maybe we should adapt, that adapting can be good, that it can be a sign of strength rather than a sign of weakness. And when we all think about what that kind of leadership means, we can also bring it into our own companies, into our own universities, into any kind of area in which we manage others or are led by others, right? How do we ask and become leaders who are flexible, adaptable, listening to evidence or change? That doesn't mean that we need to change our mind with every new thing, right? It doesn't mean that we have to be persuadable by any new movement. You can be solid and you can be flexible. You're listening to evidence, you're thinking about potentially changing your mind, but you care about credible evidence, you care about credible ideas, and it's all still led by values of care and humanity and a thoughtfulness for what it is and how we should live with each other, right? Because those kinds of rigid ideologies, they genuinely, not only do they cause the polarization and populism and division in societies that we talk about, but they really do affect how you live as a human being. And I hope that when you decide what kind of human being you want to be, that you do consider having the kind of brain that changes and adapts and maybe changes one more time, because I think that's the surest way for us individually as well to be free. So that's it for me today. I'm happy to listen to some questions or talk to you later. Thank you.
Hi. I got two questions. The first, according to this, do you think there should be ethical guidelines for political communication? And the second, how do you see the political campaigns in the future?
Great, thank you. Wonderful question. I think that in order for political campaigns to be ethical and more effective, I think first of all it's important to understand how propaganda works, how ideologies can often distort reason, logic, that they take the most rigid from us. They try to kind of take that most ideological lens and play on it. And that's an easy trick. Many authoritarian leaders, many totalitarian ideologies use that. But that's not the only way to do it, right? Sometimes we are afraid and we think, okay, well, the only way is then to be in that tyrannical mode, and we can only fight tyranny with tyranny. But I think that's both pessimistic and incomplete, because there are ways to have ethical communications, political campaigns that still value that freedom and that diversity, but that tolerance doesn't have to always be tolerance of intolerance, right? Because that's sometimes a problem for progressive liberal campaigns, is they tolerate so much, they tolerate the things that then are anti kind of human values. And so I think that we can design campaigns that maintain that focus on ethics, on humanism, but that actually bring out the best of us. Because, you know, it's not just that we all become rigid and stay rigid forever. Even after times of crisis, our brains can bounce back, and they can become flexible and creative. And actually, there's a reason why so many of us are flexible and creative, because it's hugely advantageous and it's fun. So how do we bring that out in our political campaigns? How do you celebrate that, rather than just try to, activate the rigid? And I think that when we nail that, we find that strength to do those kinds of ethical, humane, but still persuasive political campaigns. Because just because these closed ideologies can do us harm doesn't mean we can't be active political citizens. We can still come together and voice our concerns and make political change. But I don't think it has to happen through closed, dogmatic ideologies. Yeah, thank you.
¿Más preguntas? Vale, va al micro.
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much for the interesting insights. My question towards you is concerning, like, maybe one specific example of how you think this double morality of good and bad, this maniac world we live in of black, white, tall, small, can be corrected unless there's a basis of what intrinsic goodness is. How could you find, like, one example of how to define what that intrinsic goodness is to be able to break against this constant double morality of what's good, what's bad, what should be done, what shouldn't? Because I think that that's the only way, with specific examples, that you can really correct that. And I would like to know your thoughts on the matter.
Yeah, thank you. It's a huge question. I think that, for me, I do think there's a difference between ideology and philosophy. And that you can have a philosophy of how we should treat each other, how we should, treat ourselves, what it is to be ethical, what it is to be good. But the difference between a philosophy, I think, and an ideology is that in a philosophy, you think about context. You understand that there are different circumstances when that can change, right? If you have a particular rule that's ideological, that ignores context, right? It's a rule, and doesn't matter what the situation is. If you don't apply it, you betray it. You are evil, or you are defined as a traitor in some way. But in a philosophical kind of way of approaching it, you don't have to be, it's not that black and white, right? You can say, okay, here is a way in which we should all relate to each other. Here's what being a good person is: being nice to your neighbors, being considerate of others, listening to different perspectives. But you can understand that there are different circumstances, situations, when maybe it's okay if someone doesn't follow that rule. I think it's kind of about rules, right? Is it that you have a rule for what it is to be good or not? Or is it that you have a value, a general sense of what it is to be good or not, and that's constantly up for discussion? I think something that inspires me, it's difficult because it's much easier to point to ideologies than to anti-ideologies. I think one of the kind of philosophies that influences me a lot is existentialist philosophy, which I think does put at its heart the idea that our human existence unites us, it's flexible, it's fluid, but that we can still be ethical to each other by recognizing that we're all human beings and that we can come together politically, socially, without dehumanizing each other. And I think that dehumanization happens very easily in almost any ideologies, whether it's the most left-wing ideologies or the most right-wing ideologies. They can easily dehumanize those who don't agree with them or those who they see as a threat. And I think when you're more philosophically, maybe existentially minded, you can enter the political arena without that kind of hostility.
Thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Leor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Un aplauso, por favor.